Hello and welcome to the Family History Show Online 2021. We're in our final expert session of the day with our expert panel here to answer your questions. I'd like to start by introducing myself. My name is Mark Bailey and I develop tools to help people search for their ancestors and break down their brick walls. We're joined by our other experts who will be introducing shortly and giving you a couple of tips. And I'd just like to thank you all for joining us today at the Family History Show Online. Our first expert is Mia Bennett, a DNA expert and census detective who volunteers for the Society of Genealogists. Mia, do you have a top tip for us?
Hello. Yes. It's kind of linked to the talk that I gave earlier in the show. It's all about try and find those other little bits of information that might be hiding in a record. Don't just take the first thing you see. Read into the side margins, read underneath, look for any little stars or X's next to the entry and see if there was something extra added later. There's always clues hidden in those little things.
Great, thank you very much, Mia. And next we have Jill Blanchard, who is a house expert, house historian, professional genealogist as well. Jill, do you have a tip you can share with our audience?
Yes, thank you. I was thinking for both house history and family history, that one of the most important things to do is to get a really good understanding of the local area by collecting as many historic maps and even more modern maps as possible, but also looking at the local histories. And a great resource for finding out little bits about parishes, seeing where they relate to each other, administrative units and so on, is to use trade directories and look at the beginning bit of each parish, which gives you a potted history, and it'll give you all sorts of little details. It's not just about the tradespeople, it's about how the parishes run, who the important people were, who had the power, and so on. And when you combine those with maps, it can give you a fantastic resource for expanding out your research and really getting to understand an area.
Great, thank you very much, Jill. Simon Wills is also joining us again in our expert panel, and his areas of expertise include seafarers, passengers, medical ancestors and much more. Can you tell us a bit about yourself, Simon, and do you have a top tip for us?
Oh, hi Mark, thank you for welcoming me. My particular interest is maritime, and my own maritime ancestors, I can trace them back to Elizabethan times, to about 1590. I guess that's probably the most interesting genealogical fact about me. My top tip, I guess predictably, is to think about maritime ancestors, particularly if you've got those elusive ancestors you can't find. Do remember that up until about 1830, your ancestor, even if they were an ag-lab, they might have been press-ganged into the Navy. And also, lots of professions, lots of lines of work were people who would work in the merchant Navy. So cooks, engineers, electricians, laundresses, barbers, nurses. So if you can't find your ancestor, maybe they went to sea.
Many thanks, Simon. We'll also introduce Donna Rutherford, a DNA expert. Donna, have you got a top tip for us?
Hi, I do have a tip for you, a DNA tip for you. So when we're doing a DNA test, we're only getting a small percentage of DNA from all our ancestors. At each generation, we only get 50% of the DNA from our parents. So if we start looking at testing other people within our family, we're starting to build up more DNA that has come from our ancestors. So for example, even if you test a sibling, they've got a different random 50% of your parents than you have. And so with getting more of those DNA of your ancestors, you're going to build up a bigger pool of DNA matches to help start working on your genealogical puzzles. So that's my top tip. Test other people in your family after you've done your own DNA test.
Great tip there, Donna. Thank you very much. So let's continue with that DNA theme with our first question. This is from Pauline, who asks, why do genetic distances of the same ancestors change at different marker levels? My husband's taken 2 Y-DNA tests, a Y37 and a Y111. However, he can't understand why an ancestor with a genetic distance has 0 and 37 markers becomes a genetic distance of 6 at 111 markers. So I think that's one for Donna and Mia. Mia, do you want to jump in on this one?
Yes. So the way that Y-DNA tests work is what they're doing is they're checking to see kind of how similar your DNA is at a number of different places within the code. And in the case of a 37 marker test, they're looking at 37 different places on your DNA. When they increase to 111 marker, they're looking at 111 different places, 37 of which are the same places. So they do 37 and then they add more to go up to get to the 111. The way they calculate what your genetic distance is the number of differences you have with someone else at each of those markers. So most of the markers you won't have any differences, so that would score a 0. But as you test more places, you've got more chance of finding those differences. So what it's saying, the genetic distance of 0 means you've got those 37 markers you don't have any differences to. But when you test up to the 111, there are now 6 places within those additional markers where you do have a difference. And that's why, although it's the same person, you've got a different genetic distance. However, it's still indicating that this is a close Y-DNA match.
Great. Thank you very much, Mia. Next up, we have a question for Jill, and this comes from Libby. She asks, can you obtain deeds to a house prior to the year 2000? Jill?
Yeah. Yes, you can, as long as they survive. I mean, presuming that you haven't already checked with the land registries to see if there's anything there, that's the first place to start. But one of the problems with the land registry is that they don't necessarily include a whole history of your property. They may only include the previous transaction or sale. And occasionally, if there are sort of trusts or covenants attached to the property, such as rights of way, they might reference something more historical. But that isn't the end of the world. The first thing to remember is that until relatively recently, only a small percentage of people owned property. So most people were tenants. So it's always worth checking in your neighbourhood. For example, if you live in a terrace house, could it have been built by the same person, talking to your neighbours? Trying to identify local landowners and so on. But most of all, check out your county record office, because they have huge collections of deeds from a wide range of sources: solicitors, private estates, individuals. And a lot of these are only catalogued by parish, or if you're lucky, by street. So you may have to go through quite a lot of bundles, but it's worth checking anything for your area, and just widen your search to look at who else was around in the neighbourhood and who those property owners might have been.
Great advice there, Jill. Thank you very much. Our next question is another DNA one, and this time maybe Donna could answer. This comes from Wendy. And she says, I have over 58,000 DNA matches, and I'm sure I must have some NPEs. Well, we'll get onto what NPE stands for in a second. I must have some NPEs in my tree. How do I identify them, as I don't have any unidentified close matches? Should the fact that I have not identified any common ancestors as on one direct line mean that there could be an NPE in this line?
Okay, so let's explain what an NPE is. It stands for non-paternal event, or some people say non-paternity event. The more modern way of explaining this is often the term misattributed parentage. But what it basically means is the person who's in the paper record, so the person named on a birth certificate, for example, is not actually the biological parent. So most often this is the father, where the father is named on the birth certificate, but when you're doing your DNA test, you find that you're not getting any matches to that particular father, and it's possible he's not the biological father. Generally, the way this comes out in your DNA matches is you'll have a cluster of matches. So people who all match each other, and they all have a common ancestor, and you've found that common ancestor, and you can figure out how all they're connected, but you cannot work out how they connect into your tree. And as you start to build up that that family tree, you need to do a bit more research. In fact, this happened in my tree, and I found that when I was exploring this tree of this cluster of matches and the common ancestor, that to my surprise, the common ancestor of this group of matches was actually the next door neighbour of my great-great-grandparents in the 1871 census. So looking at the next door neighbours is often a good way of maybe explaining something that might have gone on. However, not having matches to a particular ancestral tree does not necessarily mean that you have an NPE that you need to worry about. It could mean you don't actually have a lot of that DNA surviving from that ancestor, so you won't get matches to that ancestor. And that's when it can be helpful to test other people in your family, because you may find your sibling has more DNA from that particular ancestor, and you'll start to get matches to the ancestor that you don't have many matches to. It could, of course, mean there is an NPE, and by looking at your cluster of matches, you can actually see if you've got a mystery cluster, then you might have a little mystery to solve somewhere in your family tree.
Brilliant. Thank you, Donna. And now we have a question for Simon Wills. This question comes in from Sue in Australia. She says, in the mid-1840s, my distant grandfather allegedly deserted the ship on which he was a seaman when it was docked in Adelaide in South Australia. We haven't been able to find his seaman's ticket, but where else might this alleged desertion have taken place and been recorded? Are you able to help with this, Simon?
I think I can help. What I would think about is that with any digitised records, some of them are missed during the digitisation process. So you could think about, I know you're in Australia, but if you're coming to London or you have someone who can do work for you in London, going to the National Archives and looking at the original records, because it is unusual to find someone who is active who's completely missing from that seaman's ticket system. So you could try that. If the seaman concerned was perhaps an apprentice at the time, look on the genealogist for the Merchant Navy apprentice records, because if they deserted, and they often did apprenticeships for quite long periods of time, that will be recorded and that will help you. And if neither of those things help, I think your only other option is to try and find the crew list for the ship concerned. Now, to do that, I'm afraid you need to know the name of the ship, which you may not have, but perhaps you might be able to unearth that through family stories or other records. And if you go onto the National Archives website, look at their research guides A to Z, find crew lists under C, and it will tell you how to find the crew list of that ship.
That's great. I hope that answers your question, Sue. And here's a question for all of our experts from Jim. He asks, what is your top tip for piecing together 17th and 18th century families in rural areas where the surname is common and they've used a limited range of forenames? It's a bit of a brick wall. But shall we start with Mia?
Yes, this is a very common occurrence, and I think we've probably all got brick walls that are due to this, but there are some useful tips that you can do to try and sort it out. One of the things for me is about actually just writing down and collecting all the data about that surname in the village and start trying to group them by things that link them together. Occupations is a wonderful way to link people. If you've got 3 John Smiths who've all got a son William, but you've got 2 that are blacksmiths, 2 that are carpenters, and 2 that are agricultural labourers, you probably know which ones they belong to. So I would always start looking for the patterns to try and discern the different people within them.
That's a great tip. Thank you, Mia. Jill, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, Mia's covered the sort of most essential bit of doing it, which is trying to reconstruct the families, and don't forget to come forwards as well as go sideways and look at the female lines as well, because you may spot other patterns with family naming traditions or the use of a mother's maiden name as a first name or a middle name. But I'd also widen your search out to look at other records, not just the parish registers, in particular poor law records if you think they were paupers, parish apprenticeships and the National Apprenticeship Index, which the SOG produce from taxation records, and seeing if you can pick up links that way. And don't forget to also look at things like probate records, which comes up in my talk, because it isn't just poor people that appear in probate records. People often leave money or gifts to apprentices or to poorer relatives, or even to their servants. So it's a case of widening out as much as possible and exploring all possible local sources, and most of these are local, of course.
Great. Thank you very much, Jill. And Simon, do you have any advice that you could give on top of this?
Well, one of my areas of expertise really is maritime. So I'm not so hot on rural, but I have exactly the same problem with maritime ancestors. Actually, in my own family, I've got 4 generations of people called Francis Wills, and at one point they were all alive at the same time. And it's very frustrating, isn't it, trying to untangle who is who. So my top tip really, I think, is to try and put together a timeline for each individual person with the same name. And there are some facts you'll be able to tie with great confidence to one individual person. Some you're not sure where they're going to fit, which Henry Smith or something is the one that married here, or which is the one that died there. But line all your Henrys up and look at them together, and you might find that, well, he was in prison, so he can't have got married on that date. He would have been 63 and the bride was only 17, so that seems an unlikely marriage. And sometimes by lining them all up together, you can narrow your options down a bit. Inevitably, I think you'll probably have to guess some of these as well. Who's the most likely person to have died then? So have a guess and then start testing your hypotheses, if you like. Now, a young man who died age 27 probably isn't going to have left a will, whereas someone who died in their 60s perhaps is more likely to. So you might find if you start testing things out that you can tie the right person or come up with the best guess really that you can. The other thing that I've sometimes done, if you have a family where a lot of people can write, is look at the signatures and compare them. Now that does depend on A, people being able to write, and B, them actually having documents to sign, which in a rural community may not be the case. But if you do have some signatures, sometimes you can actually compare them and work out who's who.
Thank you, Simon. Donna, I guess DNA can probably help in these situations as well.
Well, it might do. Autosomal DNA is good for finding living people who've descended from your ancestors about 5 to 6 generations ago. So depending on the age of the DNA tester, this might not get you far enough back. So what you could do then is look at testing older people in your family. Do you have grandparents or great aunts or aunts and uncles a generation older than you? That could push you back a little bit further if your autosomal DNA test is not going to get you far back enough to get to these particular areas. You could also consider looking at Y DNA if you've got a patrilineal line you're following, so it has to be father's 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 line. Although it's deep ancestry testing, you may find that the Y DNA test will connect you with a living person who is a common male ancestor beyond the 5 to 6 generations of the autosomal DNA. And the others have told you how to find some paperwork that might help you connect that person with you. I have used Y DNA to prove that my Rutherford line is actually from the Scottish borders around the 1600s. So even though my paper trail only gets me back to Northern Ireland in the late 1700s, being able to have a Y DNA has been able to push me back beyond that genealogical paper trail. So I now have proof that we come from the Scottish borders. Although almost impossible to find genealogical records, the Y DNA has helped me push me back that far.
Great. Some great advice. Yeah, thank you, Donna. Our next question comes from Jenny, who is after some help with a baptism query. She asks, why were some of my aunts and uncles baptised for a second time a few years after their father died in the 1830s? Jill, perhaps you could shed some light on this.
Well, it depends on when it was. In the time period can be a factor in that, because sometimes if people have moved from one parish to another, that they have the children baptised, or the adults get baptised again, in order to prove where they had settlement. Because it was one of the main ways in which you could prove you were entitled to claim poor relief. And that still applied to a certain extent with the workhouse system after the union workhouses came into force. And I presume this is referring to Church of England or Anglican baptisms as opposed to nonconformist, because obviously a conversion is an obvious reason. But then again, I recently came across a case where the family started out as Methodists and then got baptised as adults in the Church of England. So they'd obviously converted the other way. And again, it's also worth seeing if any of those people were getting married around the time they got baptised, because sometimes if people don't know if they were baptised, or they can't find a record of it, or their parents avoided them getting baptised during the period in which parish register entries were taxed, then they may go and get baptised as an adult in order, again, to prove that they've been baptised so that they could go ahead and get married.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for that insight, John. We've got another question here for Donna, and this is from Norman. He asks, I've recently found a second to third cousin DNA match who has been a sperm donor. How can I be sure that the family tree I'm researching can be relied upon for accuracy? Donna.
Well, your tree will, your research will be accurate because the sperm donor will be conceiving children, and those children may turn up in your DNA match list, and you may find from that particular match he has a lot of descendants, depending upon how active he was as a sperm donor, and you may find you get a lot of matches on that line who are all descended from him, but that won't change anything within your tree because your match is still who they are, and they've come from their own family, which you can document. So you shouldn't be expecting any issues with you matching to a sperm donor, but you may find a lot of his descendants do turn up on your match list.
Great, thank you very much, Donna. Our next question comes from Teresa, who's looking for a missing relative. She asks, can you suggest resources to search for a relative who was apprenticed to a merchant ship in 1860 out of Dartmouth, but there's no trace of him after? The ship sank in 1876, but would he have been still serving on that ship? Simon, perhaps you'll be able to shed some light on this.
Well, I think it's extremely unlikely that he'd still be on the same ship in 1876, but he was in 1860. It's just the way the merchant navy worked. Most people were employed for one voyage at a time unless they were an apprentice, in which case they might do 3 or 4 years at the start of their career on the same ship. So really unlikely that he'd be on the same ship for 16 years. You could prove that if you know the name of the ship, you could get the crew list for that particular ship, and it will tell you who was on board in 1876. So as I said in answer to one of the earlier questions, if you go to the National Archives site, look up their research guides, find the research guide on crew lists, and it will tell you how to find that. The other thing you can do is look on the genealogist, look at the Merchant Navy apprentice records, which you may have already done. This might be how you know he's on that particular ship, but find out who the employer is, and maybe they owned other ships, and you might find that he went to work on other ships owned by the same employer. You can also look at deaths at sea. If he's disappeared after 1860, there is a reasonable likelihood that he died at sea. Shipwrecks were really depressingly common in the 1860s. There were round about 35 people every week dying in a shipwreck just on the coast of the UK. So have a look on the genealogist. They've got deaths at sea after 1875. If you can't find him there, try looking on Find My Past and Ancestry, because they have deaths at sea going back to the 1850s. So you might find him on one of them or the other. And the last thing you can do, if you go into Google and type 1881 crew list database, then you'll find that there's a big index to most of the crew lists that have survived from 1881. So if he's not there, that gives you a high index of suspicion that he was dead before 1881. So you've sort of got bookends then at some time between 1860 and 1881 that he died. I hope that's helpful.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Simon. We have another question here from a visitor who wants to know more about finding a common ancestor in DNA matches. They ask, my wife was abandoned as a baby in London during 1943, and her DNA matches with various Irish and Greek ancestors. An Irish match contacted us, and they knew of two aunts, a half-uncle and a half-aunt, who were in London during the period involved. There the track ends. As for her Greek side, her DNA matches first to second cousins in various trees, of which we're having difficulty in linking. Are we right to continue to find a common ancestor in both of these situations? Donna, what would you say?
So yes, you need a good methodology to be working these matches. So hopefully you've been looking at clustering methodologies, things like the Relied method, where you start to put these matches into groups. So the matches that you've been able to find that have a tree and have given you some help, you want to be looking at all the people they match as well. And did those people help build out that tree as well? Now, often these cases, we do find we need to solve the NPEs in our matches trees first. So what I mean is that our matches could have a wrong family tree. They could have an NPE where somebody on their records is not the biological parent. So a father, for example, named on a birth certificate is not the biological father. So you may be coming up on that as to why you can't link them all together. And so sometimes during this work, we have to solve those NPEs before we can go and solve the unknown parentage. But once you've established that common ancestor, what you need to do is group all those people together in your cluster, build out their tree all together, find that common ancestor after you've solved issues with perhaps errors in trees, and then start bringing that tree forwards in time to try and find that right person who's in the right place at the right time. It can also help to test at other places to build up your pool of matches. So if you're struggling with finding a common ancestor between the matches that you do know match each other, and it could be because their trees are wrong or they've got an NPE they don't know about, trying to test in other places might bring in more matches for you to help build up and find that common ancestor. And thanks for a quick tip from Mia. Also look at testing at 23andMe if you haven't already. Apparently they have a really good testing population for people from Greece. So a top tip to go and have a look if you haven't tested there already. Think about testing there and pull in those matches as well. Once you've been working on all these clusters and you've got your common ancestor, if you don't know about this already, there's a fantastic tool called WATO, What Are the Odds? And this is housed on DNA Painter's site, dnapainter.com. It's a brilliant way to help out where you will fit in with these matches once you've worked out that common ancestor. And you can start to hypothesize where you might fit in, leading you to which branch you might actually be descended from. It does take a lot of time, so it's like putting a jigsaw puzzle together without knowing what the picture is sometimes when you're trying to solve an unknown parentage case. So keep at it. You never know. Tomorrow you might get another close match that really pulls all this together and you start to find those common ancestors. It sounds like you're on the right path, so just keep going. It is one of those things that you've just got to keep repeating, look at those trees, build up the jigsaw puzzle, and start to see if you can work out where you fit in. I hope that helps.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Donna. And on to the last question of the day. And Fiona is looking for advice on sources to cover the 1500s to 1600s beyond the visitations. Perhaps you would all like to share a bit of an answer on this question. So Mia, shall we start with you?
Being a specialist on DNA, I'm finding I'm not going back to this time period very often. But one thing I have discovered when I've been at the Society of Genealogists is their wonderful collection of pedigree rolls. These date from some more recent ones, but several of them go back to that kind of 1500s, 1600s time period. And even though some of them may be right, some of them may be wrong, they're as good as any tree that's created now. They're wonderful places to go and get clues from. They're places where you can start seeing some family relationships. It might give you a clue of where to go and look, what parishes to hunt out those older records from. So for me, it's actually going back into some of the old historic paper-based records can actually give you some fascinating clues.
Great, thank you, Mia. And Donna, perhaps this earlier period might be useful to use some DNA matching. Have you got any tips there?
So it's certainly out of the range of autosomal DNA testing, but here we do have our deep ancestry testing, Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA. Now that might, and I say might because it's a much smaller testing pool than we're used to with autosomal DNA. If you've got a matrilineal line or a patrilineal line and you can find someone to test, so for Y-DNA you need to find a male to test on the patrilineal line. Anybody can do a mitochondrial DNA test. And here you can start to find matches that do go back to much earlier than the typical genealogical timeframe of 5 to 6 generations. And I was answering another question earlier where I was explaining for my Rutherford line that my uncle's done a Y-DNA test, and we'll be able to prove that we have matches back to the Scottish borders, back probably around about the 1600s. And we've been pushing back on the genealogy side with records, getting back to about Northern Ireland in the late 1700s. But the Y-DNA has been able to give us matches with people that very definitely go directly back to the Scottish borders. And that's really helped us build up our our knowledge of our genealogical background. And you may all remember the king under the car park, Richard III in Leicester, and you started to use this type of DNA testing for him as well. And in fact, it was mitochondrial DNA where they were able to find somebody that was matching to that particular line. And he tested, and they used the mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, to actually connect up to this living cousin that was part of the proof used for Richard III. So this will help you just push you back further than we're used to with the autosomal DNA testing of the 5 to 6 generations.
Great, thank you very much, Donna. And Jill, do you have any further advice for this sort of time period, 15 to 1600s?
Well, yes, I did quite a lot of work in the 1600s and sometimes before. Visitations are a useful source, but of course it's only a small percentage of people, and it indicates people that have property, possibly coats of arms and so on. But there are lots of other sources, all the usual sources. I mean, the parish registers in theory can take you back to 1638 if they survive, although most don't survive much before 1600s. But again, I would really recommend looking at things like probate records, which can go back into the 1300s, and I think some of the earliest are from the 12s. Also, parish records, including the poor law, will take you back into the early 1600s if they survive. And any property estate records, including manorial, because they often include tenants and as well as purchases and sales and inheritances, which many people took over tenancies from relatives and so on. So you can find out a lot about a wide range of spectrum of the population, not just those that might appear in the visitations. And we touched on apprenticeship records earlier, and again, you may, depends on where you're looking, the main place you'll find those in that period will be cities and large towns, which were boroughs, but some of them do go back into that period. So again, it is widening out your sources and not just relying on one.
Great, thank you very much, Jill. So it turns out there's a great deal of records for you to help research that period of time. Now I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, and I'd just like to thank our experts one last time. So Mia Bennett is one of our census detectives for the Society of Genealogists, and also does a lot of DNA analysis. You can find out more about Mia's work at miagenealogy.com. Simon is an author and journalist and expert genealogist, and you can find out more about Simon on his Amazon page by searching for Simon Wills on Amazon. Jill is a house historian, author, and runs many different courses on researching your family history. You can find out more about Jill on her websites, pastsearch.co.uk and pastsearchlearning.co.uk. You can find out more about Donna online at her website, donnarutherford.com, and also her Facebook page, the DNA Help for Genealogy UK group. So just search on Facebook for DNA Help Genealogy UK. If you'd like to find out, if you'd like to watch more talks from our experts, if you've enjoyed what you've been watching today, there's a huge variety of different talks available, all to stream from the comfort of your own home at family-history.tv. It's a new and upcoming website, and more videos are being added all the time as new talks are being recorded. We'd like to thank all of our experts, exhibitors, sponsors, partners, and of course all of you who have attended our online show today and made it the success it has been. So thank you very much, and if you enjoyed your show, the show today, look out for us. We're coming back in September online. I'm afraid to say that the September show will not be an in-person event. It's just a bit too, we feel it's a bit too unsafe at the minute to all meet in person indoors. So we're making the September event on the 25th of September this year an online show again. So you can purchase your tickets now from thefamilyhistoryshow.com. Thank you very much for watching, everybody. And just remember that you can watch all of these talks for the next 72 hours. So don't worry if you've missed any talks today. They'll still be online to stream for the next couple of days. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.